The documentation had described her accurately. He had read it in the pre-assignment briefing, the specific documentation of the bilateral training program's senior Keth instructor, the account of the 14 years and the flawless combat record and the Keth warrior tradition's most decorated active instructor, the account that was trying to be accurate and was also, in the trying, slightly intimidated by its subject. He had read the documentation, and he had been in the outpost for 3 weeks, and he had been in the daily proximity of the person the documentation was describing. The daily proximity always produced the understanding that the documentation could not. The documentation said, flawless combat record. The daily proximity said, the person who had the flawless combat record was a person whose relationship with the flawless combat record was the most interesting thing about her, and the most interesting thing about her was not in the documentation. He had been noting this for 3 weeks. The outpost on Varath 5 had the quality of the remote military training environments, the specific quality that the sustained operational tempo and the cross-species proximity and the frontier posting produced in the people who were in it for the duration. The outpost's personnel were the bilateral training program's current cohort, the Joint Authorities training specialists, and the Keth Warrior Corps instructors, and the specific mix of the two traditions in the same operational context that the bilateral program required. He was the Joint Authorities training specialist assigned to the cross-species combat readiness assessment, the function that required the patient observation of what the different traditions were actually doing to the people in them, which was the function he had been finding more interesting than the function's technical documentation had suggested it would be. The assignment for the week's joint exercise was communicated on the 4th week's first morning. The assignment paired him with the senior Keth combat instructor for the combined human-Keth combat readiness assessment. He read the assignment with the quality of someone who finds the assignment interesting. He found the assignment interesting because 3 weeks of the daily proximity had produced the specific observation that the assignment confirmed. Sorvaine Thael was the person in the outpost whose function was the most technically sophisticated, and whose relationship with her own function was the most complex. And the most complex relationship with the most technically sophisticated function was the most interesting operational subject in the outpost's current cohort. He prepared for the joint exercise's first day with the quality of the cross-species integration work, the patient observation of the specific thing, and the adjustment to what the observation produced. He also thought about the documentation. The documentation said, impossible to read. He had been reading her for 3 weeks. The documentation's impossible to read meant most people don't look in the right direction. The right direction was not the record's direction. The right direction was the direction of the person who was in the record and who was not the record. He had been looking in the right direction for 3 weeks. He went to the joint exercise's first day with what 3 weeks of looking in the right direction had produced. She was at the exercise's staging point with the quality that the documentation had been trying to describe, and which the documentation's description was insufficient for. The quality that the daily proximity had given him the 3 weeks accumulation of. The quality of someone whose presence was the full engagement's quality at all times, whose attention was the full kind, whose function was the function she had been in for 14 years, with the full quality of the tradition she had been in for 14 years. She said, training specialist Moren. He said, senior instructor Thael. She said, the assessment begins at the first light's conclusion. He said, yes. She said, the assessment's parameters. He said, yes. They went through the assessment's parameters with the quality of 2 professionals in the function's preparation, the professional quality of the function's beginning. He was in the function's preparation, and he was also in the function's preparation in the continuation of the 3 weeks observation, the observation of the specific thing the documentation had not described, and which the daily proximity had been accumulating. She caught him looking. She said, the assessment's 3rd parameter. He said, yes. The 3rd parameter's tactical integration requirement. She said, yes. He said, yes. He went back to the parameters. He thought. The documentation said impossible to read. The documentation was wrong. The first day had the friction. The friction was the friction that the cross-species integration work always produced in the first day, the specific friction of 2 different approaches to the same function encountering each other in the operational context for the first time. Not the friction of incompatibility. The friction of the different assumptions meeting the different assumptions and neither assumption having the immediate category for the other assumption's presence. Her approach to the combat readiness assessment was the Keth tradition's approach. The full commitment to the current phase's execution, the complete engagement with the present operational requirement, the assumption that the function was worth the full expression of the capacity at every moment. His approach was the cross-species integrations approach. The patient observation of the overall picture, the adjustment to the developing situation, the assumption that the present moment's information was the instrument for the next moment's decision. The friction was, her full commitment to the current phase met his observation of the current phase's development and produced the specific friction of the person who was fully in the moment meeting the person who was fully in the observation of the moment. By the first day's end, he had the adjustment. He said, at the first day's debrief, your approach commits fully to the current phase. My approach observes the current phase for the next phase's preparation. The friction is the phases being different. She said, yes, I've identified this. He said, the second day's approach, I commit to the current phase in the execution. You observe the current phase for the next phase in the planning. We alternate. She said, the alternation requires the trust that the other person's phase is the correct phase at the correct moment. He said, yes. She said, and the basis for that trust. He said, one day of the observation, it's a limited basis. She said, yes. He said, the assessment's second day will produce more data. She said, yes. She said it in the register of someone who was in the uncertainty of the limited basis and who was managing the uncertainty with the professional quality that the limited basis required. The second day, the friction became productive. The productive friction was the specific quality of the two approaches in the correct phase relationship. Her full commitment in the execution phases and his observation in the planning phases. The alternation producing the combined approach that neither tradition produced alone. They were not seamless. The seams were visible, and the seams were the productive friction, the places where the two approaches met and produced the specific quality of the meeting of the different assumptions in the correct relationship. They were good at the productive friction. By the second day's end, she said, the alternation works. He said, yes. The seams are the productive part. She said, yes. She said it with the quality of someone who was in the accurate description of the thing they had been in. The third day, they were working. The working had the specific quality of two people who had been through the friction and the productive friction, and who were, in the working, in the function that the 2 days had built. The function was not the function of the same approach. It was the function of the two approaches in the correct relationship, and the correct relationship was the relationship that the 2 days of the productive friction had established. The third day's most demanding segment was the sustained operational period, the specific test of the combined capacity under the sustained conditions that the assessment's third day typically reserved for the evaluation's most significant component. They were in the sustained operational period for 4 hours. 4 hours of the full engagement, her commitment in the execution phases and his observation in the planning phases, and the alternation's productive seams, and the function they had built in 2.5 days being tested by the most demanding component. The sustained operational period's conclusion came at the afternoon's midpoint. They were in the outpost's equipment area for the break, the post-exercise quality of the 4 hours sustained effort, the specific quality of the significant physical and mental effort's completion. He was managing the break with the quality of someone who had been in the 4 hours and who was in the 4 hours aftermath. She was in the post-exercise analysis. He knew this quality from 3 weeks of the outpost's proximity. The Keth tradition's post-exercise analysis was the specific internal process that the Keth warrior tradition required after the significant operational engagement. The process of going through the exercises, events in the specific analytical register that the tradition had developed for the evaluation of the execution's quality. She was doing it with the specific expression that the internal analysis produced, the focused expression of someone who was in the deep engagement with the internal process, the expression that had the quality of the concentrated attention turned inward. He looked at her. He said, you know, when you're focused like that, you look kind of cute. He said it in the register of the accurate observation, the register of someone who had noticed the specific thing and who was saying the specific thing because the specific thing was what was there to say. She froze. The freeze had the specific quality of the information that had no category. He had been in enough of the cross-species integration work to recognize the specific quality of the moment when the information arrived in the space where the category was absent. The moment of the genuine unexpected. The moment that the categories couldn't process because the categories hadn't been built for this specific information. The freeze was that moment. She was in it with the full quality of someone who was in the genuine unexpected, not the managed response to the unexpected, the actual experience of the thing that had no available category, the thing that was too real and too immediate and too specifically accurate to be deflected into any of the available management strategies. He was reading this with the quality of someone who had been observing the specific thing rather than the record for 3 weeks, and who was, in the reading, finding the moment more interesting than alarming. Around them, the outpost's equipment area had the quality of the people who were in the proximity of the significant unexpected, the other personnel who had been in the break's ordinary ambient, and who were now in the ambient's disruption. The Keth warrior whose reputation was the intimidating presence and the flawless record and the impossible to read. The color. The Keth physiology's embarrassment response was not the human physiology's embarrassment response. The documentation had noted the Keth physiological response's specific quality, the specific color that the Keth embarrassment produced in the face's secondary tone. He had read this in the documentation and had not expected to be the person who produced the occasion for the documentation's observation to become the direct experience. He said, "I'm sorry, that was." She said no. She said it in the register of someone who was managing the recovery from the genuine unexpected, and who was managing it with the quality that the recovery required. The quality of not letting the management become the thing the moment became. The people around them had the quality of people who were in the significant unexpected, and who were managing the being in it with the quality that the outpost's operational context required. He said, "No." She said, "No. Don't apologize for it." He said, "Yes." She said, "No one has said that." She said it in the specific register of the statement that was both the accurate account of the factual situation and the account of something larger than the factual situation. The register of the statement that was true in the immediate sense and true in the broader sense simultaneously. He said, "Yes, I know, that's probably why I said it." She said, "Why?" He said, "The accurate thing often goes unsaid when it's the unexpected accurate thing. The expected accurate thing gets said. The unexpected accurate thing waits for the person who says the thing that's there to say rather than the thing that's expected." She said, "And you say the thing that's there to say?" He said, "Yes. Usually." She said, "Yes." She said it with the quality of someone who was in the recovery's progress and who was in the progress in something else, something that the recovery's progress was revealing rather than concealing. He said, "The post-exercise analysis." She said, "Yes." He said, "You were in it when I said it." She said, "Yes." He said, "The focus had a specific quality, the internal kind, the kind that's the genuine engagement with the thing you're analyzing rather than the presented focus of the function's performance." She said, "You were observing the post-exercise analysis." He said, "I was observing your face during the post-exercise analysis." "Yes." She said, "You were observing my face." He said, "Yes." She said, "Not the analysis." He said, "The analysis was in the face. I was observing both." She said, "Yes." She said it with the quality of the thing received. He said, "Are we continuing the exercise tomorrow?" She said, "Yes." "The 4th day's assessment begins at the first light's conclusion." He said, "Yes." She said, "The alternation continues." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." The break concluded and the outpost's equipment area returned to the ordinary function, and he went back to the day's remaining work with the quality of someone who had been in the significant moment and who was in the significant moment's aftermath. He thought the freeze, he thought the color, he thought the documentation said impossible to read. The documentation was trying to describe the record. The record was impossible to read because the record was the thing everyone looked at, and the record was designed to be the thing that was presented rather than read. He thought the face was readable. He thought, yes, he thought, the person behind the record is always readable if you look in the right direction. He thought, yes. At the day's end in the outpost's common area, the other personnel had the quality of the people who had been in the proximity of the significant unexpected, and who were in the aftermath with the quality of the people who had witnessed something they had not previously witnessed. One of the Joint Authorities training specialists, a thorough woman named Vel Sorath, who had been at the outpost for 3 months, and who had been in the proximity of the senior Keth combat instructor for 3 months, said to him. The cute remark. He said, "Yes," she said. "In 3 months I have never seen that expression on her face." He said, "Yes." She said, "What were you thinking?" He said, "I was saying the accurate thing." She said, "Yes, I know. What were you thinking?" He said, "That the accurate thing was worth saying." She said, "Yes." She said it with the quality of someone who had received the answer and who was in the answer with the full quality of her attention. She said, "You've been observing her for 3 weeks." He said, "Yes." She said, "Not the record." He said, "The record is well documented. I was observing the person." She said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." The fourth day had the quality of the day after the significant unexpected, the quality of the thing that had occurred the previous day being present in the day's operational context, without the thing's presence being the explicit content. They were in the fourth day's assessment, with the quality of the working that the third day had established, and with the additional quality of the cute remark's presence in the operational context. The presence that was not the explicit content, but which was the quality of the context in which the working occurred. She was in the function with her full quality. She was also, and he was noting this with the specific attention of 3 weeks accumulation, in the function with the specific additional quality that the cute remark's aftermath had produced. Not the transformed quality, not the person changed by the remark. The person who had been in the remark's genuine unexpected, and who was, in the remark's aftermath, in the function with the specific quality of someone who was carrying a new piece of information, and who was in the carrying. He did not address this directly. The fourth day's work was the work. The alternation was in the correct relationship. The productive friction was productive. The function was the function. At the fourth day's end, she said, "The fifth day is the exercise's final day." He said, "Yes." The assessment's conclusion, she said, "The combined evaluation." He said, "Yes." "The joint result of the 5 days," she said. "The alternation has produced the specific quality in the combined result that the bilateral program's assessment requires." He said, "Yes." "The seams are the productive part." She said, "Yes." She said it, and then she said, "I want to talk about the cute remark." He said, "Yes." She said, "Not tonight, tomorrow." He said, "Yes." She said, "The fifth day's break, the mid-exercise interval." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." The fifth day was the assessment's conclusion. The combined evaluation of the 5 days' joint function. The bilateral training program's assessment of the combined human-Keth combat readiness in the operational context. They were in the combined evaluation with the full quality of the 5 days working, the function that the friction and the productive friction and the working had built across the week. The mid-exercise interval came at the 5th day's midpoint. They were at the outpost's equipment area, the same location as the 3rd day's break, the specific location of the cute remark. He was aware of the location. She said, "The cute remark." He said, "Yes." She said, "I've been thinking about it since the 3rd day." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to tell you what I've been thinking." He said, "Yes." She said, "No one has said it because no one has looked in the direction the remark required looking." He said, "What direction?" She said, "The direction that isn't the record. The record is what everyone looks at. The record is what I am in the outpost's context and the bilateral program's context and the Keth warrior tradition's context." He said, "Yes." She said, "The record is 14 years old. The record began when I entered the Keth Warrior Corps at 18, and it has been the thing I am in every context I have been in since 18. He said, "Yes." She said, "You looked in the other direction." He said, "I looked at your face during the post-exercise analysis." She said, "Yes." "The direction that isn't the record." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to tell you what it's like to carry the record." He said, "Yes." She said, "The record is the thing the tradition produces in the person who performs the tradition's function with the quality the tradition requires. The record is the accurate account of the function's execution." He said, "Yes." She said, "The record is also," she found the word, "the only account." He said, "Yes." He said, "The only account that the record's context provides." She said, "Yes. In the outpost's context, I am the record. In the bilateral program's context, I am the record. In the Keth warrior tradition's context, I am the record." He said, "And the person carrying the record," she said, "is not visible in the record's context because the record fills the context." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." She was quiet. She said, "The post-exercise analysis, the focused expression." He said, "Yes." She said, "The focused expression is the internal analysis's expression. The internal analysis is the thing I do after every significant operational engagement. The Keth tradition requires it, and I would do it without the requirement because the requirement is accurate about what the function needs." He said, "Yes." She said, "The focused expression is not the record's expression. The record's expression is the presented quality, the intimidating presence, the impossible to read, the documented quality that the record produces in the context." He said, "Yes." She said, "The focused expression is the person's expression. The internal analysis's expression. the expression that is present when the internal function is the thing being expressed rather than the presented function. He said, yes, he said. And cute, she said, yes. She said it with the specific quality of the word received in the direct register, the word that had been in the freeze and the color and the 3 days of the thinking, and which was now being said by her in the register of the acknowledged thing. He said, yes, cute, the specific quality of the focused expression in the internal analysis's expression, the concentration and the genuine engagement, and the word, realness of the expression when the presented function isn't the function being expressed. She said the realness, he said, yes. The presented function has the quality of the presentation. The internal function has the quality of the genuine thing. The genuine thing's expression in the face has the quality I described. She said, cute. He said, yes. She said, no one has described it that way. He said, yes. She said, no one has described it at all. He said, yes, I know. She said, you said the accurate thing often goes unsaid when it's the unexpected accurate thing. He said, yes. She said, the accurate thing in this case is not the expected accurate thing because the direction the accurate thing required looking was not the direction everyone looks. He said, yes. She said, you've been looking in the other direction for 3 weeks. He said, yes. She said, why? He said, the record is thoroughly documented. I had the documentation. The person carrying the record was the undocumented thing. The undocumented thing is the more interesting thing to observe, she said. The undocumented thing. He said, yes. The cross-species integration work's primary instrument is the observation of the undocumented thing, what the different traditions are actually doing to the people in them, the thing the documentation can't capture because the documentation captures the tradition, and the person is not the tradition. She said, the person carrying the record is not the record. He said, yes. The person carrying the record is the person who is in the record and who is also in everything the record doesn't describe. The record describes the function's execution. The record doesn't describe the internal analysis's expression in the post-exercise break. She said, or the freeze. He said, yes. She said, or the color. He said, yes. She said, you found those interesting rather than alarming. He said, yes. The freeze and the color were the accurate responses to the unexpected accurate thing. They were the person's responses. The record doesn't have those responses. She said, no. The record doesn't have those responses. He said, yes. She said, I've been trying to determine what to do with the fact that you said the accurate, unexpected thing and found the response interesting rather than alarming. He said, yes, she said. In 14 years of the function, no one has done those 2 things in the sequence you did them. He said, yes, I thought that was probably the case. She said, why did you think that? He said, the freeze's quality. The freeze was the genuine unexpected, the person who had the category for everything and who encountered the thing without a category. The thing without a category was the cute remark. The cute remark had no category because in 14 years of the function, no one had said the accurate, unexpected thing in the direction that wasn't the record's direction. She said, and the category's absence produced the freeze. He said, yes. And the color, she said, and the color. He said, yes. He said, I want to say something about the color. She said, yes. He said, the color is in the documentation. The Keth physiological embarrassment response. The bilateral relationships documentation described it. She said, yes. He said, the documentation described it as the physiological response to the significant unexpected in the social context. The response that occurs when the social context produces the information that has no available category in the tradition's social framework. She said, yes. He said, the documentation described it accurately. She said, yes. He said, and the documentation noted that the response was the genuine response, not the performed response, the physiological response that occurs independently of the person's intention. She said, yes, the color is not a choice. He said, yes. He said, the color was the genuine response to the genuine unexpected. She said, yes. He said, yes. He said, I found the color interesting. She said, yes. You said that, he said. I found it interesting because the color was the person's response. The record doesn't have the color. The person has the color. The color was the person. She was quiet for the specific duration of someone in the significant thing. She said, the cute remark produced the person. He said, yes. In the specific way of the accurate, unexpected thing, the thing that arrives in the space the categories don't cover, and which produces the genuine response rather than the category's response. She said, and you were waiting for the genuine response. He said, I was saying the accurate thing. The genuine response was the consequence. She said, "You are not calculating the consequence." He said, "No, the accurate thing was the accurate thing." "I said it," she said. "Yes." She said it with the quality of the thing fully present, the 3 days of thinking, and the freeze, and the color, and the person behind the record, and the cute remark, and the direction that wasn't the record's direction, and the undocumented thing. He said the 5th day's assessment concludes at the afternoon's end. She said, "Yes." He said the bilateral program's evaluation. She said, "Yes." He said the combined result. She said, "Yes." The seams were the productive part. He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to say something about the week." He said, "Yes." She said the first day's friction. He said, "Yes." She said the friction was the record meeting the person. He said the Keth tradition's approach and the cross-species integration's approach. She said, "Yes, but also the record and the person."